a long while. Since the last time I filmed a video, I have gotten married. My husband and I built a house and we had a baby. Lots to catch up on, but today I want to talk about my birth story. So my daughter was born at 38 weeks and 4 days, but I want to say my birth story starts at 36 weeks. So at my 36-week appointment, I had a growth scan. In the third trimester, I had gestational diabetes, so part of that complication required some additional growth scans towards the end of my pregnancy, just to make sure that baby wasn't getting too big. At my 36-week appointment, we had our growth scan, which is essentially a ultrasound and some measurements. After we did measurements, everything was looking great there. Then we watched baby for a little while, and we watched for a good while. I wasn't sure exactly what the ultrasound technician was looking for, but I knew what my husband and I were looking for, and that was just to see baby move. So we watched for a while and baby wasn't moving, so the tech asked me to stand up and do some jumps. She pushed it on my stomach a little bit, and then we watched again. We're staring at the screen for a couple minutes and baby isn't moving. Technician says that she wants to give it 5 more minutes. So I probably make it maybe a minute and a half before I start tearing up. The technician told me that she would bring my doctor in. So doctor comes in and tells me that, obviously we're looking for baby to make some movements. At this appointment so far, she hasn't made any movement. He had asked me if I felt any kicks all day. At this time, I was still working full-time, and towards the end of the pregnancy, I never really counted kicks. I remember when he asked me that, I just genuinely could not remember the last kick that I felt. So doctor decides that he'd like to send me to the hospital just to do some additional monitoring. My husband and I packed up very emotionally, and we started to make our way over to the birthing center. So the birthing center was in a building right across from my OB/GYN's building. So it was super close, but we did end up going into the wrong building at first. And so once we were redirected to the right building, they admitted me for some monitoring. At the hospital, I just got hooked up, and we were just doing basically an NST, measuring baby's heart rate and my contractions and seeing how baby was handling those contractions. So we were in the hospital for about, I want to say close to 2 hours. And within that 2 hours, I did actually end up feeling baby kick, which was a huge relief. Doctor came in every so often just to check in with me, check in and let us know how things are looking with baby, and everything was totally fine. So we get sent home that night, and that coming weekend, my husband had a really great opportunity to go see some of his favorite sports teams out in Texas. Knowing that we did the check at the hospital and everything was looking great, no complications other than the gestational diabetes, I was comfortable with him going. So at 36 weeks, just about 37 weeks, my husband goes out of state for his trip. His trip is great. He comes back. At this point, I am 37 weeks, and we go in for my next checkup. At this checkup, it was actually really brief. They did their measurements, we saw baby, and we did see baby move at this appointment, so it was pretty easy, pretty quick, nothing crazy at that appointment. Now I am 38 weeks pregnant. So at 38 weeks pregnant, I definitely started doing all of the old wives' tales things to do to induce labor. I was drinking raspberry leaf tea, going on my walks, doing the sidewalk steps, all the things, because one of the things I wanted from my pregnancy and birth is to go into labor naturally. One night we go out for Chinese for dinner, and then after dinner we do a Target run because I wanted to get a couple of things for my hospital bag. And I remember stepping foot into Target, barely making it through the doors, and I stopped because I have a pretty intense contraction. These were one of those contractions or Braxton Hicks where I couldn't walk through it. So I just had to breathe through it, and a couple moments later, we're good. I grabbed a couple of things, just travel size, shampoo, conditioner, things that I would want at the hospital, and then we go home. At night, I remember still having some pretty intense Braxton Hicks, but again, nothing still consistent. So we go to bed that night, and I wake up at midnight to another intense contraction. So this wasn't anything too abnormal for me, just because I've experienced a couple more intense Braxton Hicks that have woken me up in the night. So I didn't think too much about it, went back to bed. I would say maybe 15 minutes later, I wake up to another intense contraction. At this point, this one woke me up a good bit, so I just kind of get out of bed. I'm up and about having more Braxton Hicks, some a little bit more intense than others. I don't know if this is labor or not, so I'm just kind of awake and seeing if I can do anything to keep the contractions coming. So I remember going on the stairs and just kind of doing some stretches and bouncing on the ball a little bit. At this point, the contractions weren't stopping. They still weren't consistent, but since I'd gotten out of bed, I was still having them. So I decided to start timing them. So I'm timing contractions for about an hour, and I'm averaging about, I want to say it was about 7 to 8 minutes apart, but these contractions were definitely a little bit more intense than the Braxton Hicks. So I felt like something was happening, but I still wasn't sure. My OBGYN at a prior appointment had told me that there's 3 main things to look for before you go into the hospital. 1, your water breaks. 2, you have that bloody show or you lose your mucus plug. Or 3, I believe it's you have contractions for at least an hour, a minute long, within 5 minutes apart. So I call my OBGYN's office to reach an after hours nurse just to get a better idea of what my next steps should be. So I let her know that I'm still averaging about 7 to 8 minutes apart, how they're feeling. We kind of chat a little bit about it. Nurse tells me that it sounds like I am getting into early labor or about to go into labor, but not quite there yet. So she suggested that I just do some more steps, some more positions, just to make some of those contractions a little bit more comfortable. But she said that I still have some time and to go in maybe when the contractions are closer to 5 minutes apart. Also let her know that, again, I didn't lose my mucus plug yet or water break. To both of us, it sounded like we were still pretty early in the stages of labor, so I would have some time. So my husband this night was pretty sick. He had a nasty cold, probably from traveling. I didn't want to wake him yet until I knew that we needed to go. And chatting with the nurse and just kind of feeling out how I felt in that moment, it still felt like we had quite a bit of time. So I'm still getting these contractions. Again, nothing too crazy, but they're definitely more intense than some of those Braxton Hicks that I had experienced. Then about 3 a.m. rolls around and I am starting to get pretty restless, and I feel like I just needed some additional support. And I also realized that we had not installed the baby car seat yet, and for some reason in that moment it felt like a big deal, so I woke my husband up. I woke him up, told him that I was getting these contractions. Nurse said that we probably are still in the early stages, but this car seat needed to go in immediately. It's November, so it's freezing outside, but he goes out there and he installs our car seat. Hindsight, definitely wasn't necessary because the hospital stay and all those things, there was plenty of time to get a car seat installed. But he gets that done and it's about 4 in the morning at this point, and contractions are still pretty intense, still averaging, I want to say at this point, about 6-7 minutes apart. No water break, no bloody show, but I was getting uncomfortable enough that I wanted to head to the hospital pretty soon. Just wanted to see more happen before I felt like I was ready to go into the hospital, because I don't know why I had this fear, but, and it really doesn't matter, but I didn't want to be one of those women that go into the hospital and get turned around. It's 5 in the morning at this point. Contractions still aren't within 5 minutes apart, but I am ready to go to the hospital. So I didn't have very many pregnancy cravings, but I will say the one thing that I was always down for was Chick-fil-A breakfast. Chick-fil-A opens at 6 o'clock. It's about 5 o'clock right now, and I tell my husband I want to get Chick-fil-A before we head to the hospital. I've always been told by other mama friends that you should eat before you go to the hospital, because once you get there, they don't let you eat. And I know there's reasons for that, but I really needed Chick-fil-A this morning. So we linger around for a little bit before we head over to Chick-fil-A to grab breakfast. And before we leave, I want to say it's about 5:30 at this point. My hospital is about 7 minutes away from my house. Chick-fil-A is twice that, still not too far, but twice that. So I figured that If I didn't have my contractions within the 5 minutes, water still hasn't broke, no bloody show, and at that point, none of those things were happening, so figured we still have some time, we're gonna go get some breakfast. So we drive over to Chick-fil-A, and we're a few minutes early before they open, and I think that's when I realized that I goofed. My contractions at this point are so intense that I don't even care if I didn't meet any of those 3 criteria. After we get breakfast, I'm going to the hospital. So I'll mention my birth plan or birth preference, whatever you want to call it. I simply just wanted a medicated hospital birth. Spoiler alert, that's not exactly what happened. We're waiting to order at Chick-fil-A. I don't even care about the criteria anymore. I just know that I want to grab my breakfast, head to the hospital, because I am ready to be medicated. So we get through the drive-thru, make our order, get our food, and I ask him to stop for just a few minutes so I can scarf down my breakfast, because every little crack, bump, turn is incredibly uncomfortable. There's just no way to comfortably labor in a car safely. Like, I remember at one point I just took my seatbelt off and I was facing the car seat, like turned around facing the car seat, because I just needed to move and get my body into a comfortable position to get through those contractions. So we park for a few minutes, I take a couple bites, but my contractions at this point are way too intense that I can't even comfortably eat, even though I want to. So I'm just like, let's go, and we book it to the hospital. So I said I realized I goofed when we got to Chick-fil-A, but the drive to the hospital is when I started to get scared. I'm still contracting throughout the drive, and I realized at one point, the only way that I can get through the contraction comfortably is when I push. At this point also, I totally stopped timing my contractions because I feel like in that moment, the only thing I could focus on was getting through the contraction. So I really don't know how far my contractions were, but I knew that my water hadn't broke yet. I still hadn't lost my mucus plug, and I am having these contractions that I feel like I need to push, and I'm scared, and we are flying to the hospital. We get to the hospital, and I'm gonna mention this because I feel like whenever my husband tells our birth story, he always mentions this part even though I don't remember it. We park, he gets out of the car and comes to the passenger side, and he opens the door for me to get out of the car, and I tell him, shut the door, I'm not moving, because I'm in the middle of a contraction. So he runs back to the driver's side, gets into the car, and I just get through this contraction. And then after a couple of moments, I'm like, okay, I'm ready. And we leave the car and we start walking. As we're walking to the hospital, I am stopping every few moments because I'm having contractions that I just cannot walk through. I can barely breathe, I can barely think. I definitely can't walk through them, and so it takes us a good bit to actually get to the birthing center. We get to the lobby, my husband checks us in, and I am leaning over a table in the lobby, absolutely wailing, because at this point I just have almost no self-control. The contractions are so intense, I can barely think, I can barely breathe, and I just want to get medication. Any type of relief, I wanted it. I do also remember though, when we were in the lobby and my husband was checking us in, there was such a lovely couple right behind my husband waiting to check in as well, and they had matching outfits and our cute hospital bag, and I remember thinking that was supposed to be me. I had left the house that morning for breakfast in my husband's pajama pants, a tank top, a cardigan, hair a wreck, a total mess, because I was just totally out of my mind. While my husband was checking us in, I remember the nurses coming out and just waving me in. And I could hear them kind of talking to each other in the background because I don't think I was really present in that moment. We're talking amongst each other, and they had said something along the lines of, forget the paperwork, let's just get her weight check. Check my weight, they moved me into a triage room, and they immediately asked me to undress, get in a hospital gown, and I do that. That is when I realized I lost my mucus plug. So somewhere between leaving the house for Chick-fil-A and getting to the hospital, I had lost my mucus plug. My water still hadn't broke yet. At this point, I'm assuming my contractions are within the 5 minutes apart. And so I am excited to be in a hospital gown, got my IV in. I am ready for medication. Nurses come back in after I'm all dressed and hooked up, and they do a check. So up to this point, I've actually hadn't ever gotten a cervical check. I believe they start doing that at 36 or 37 weeks, but at my 36-week appointment, we had that hospital scare, so they sent me to the hospital. And then at my 37-week appointment, they offered a check or a sweep, whatever it's called, and I declined because my husband was out of state and I didn't want to do anything to potentially encourage labor because he wasn't back yet. So I get my first cervical check at this moment. The nurse tells me that I am 9.5 centimeters dilated. When I tell you, I was floored. I don't think words can explain my reaction and how I felt in that moment. I was anxious, nervous, excited, all of the above. But in that moment, the first thing that came out of my mouth was, can I get an epidural? The nurses chuckle a little bit and they tell me that let's get you into the delivery room and we can talk about options. So at this point, they are pushing me to the delivery room, and as they're pushing me, I remember telling the nurse, I'm having a contraction and I feel like I need to push. She looks at me and she says, if you feel like you need to push, you can push. In that moment, that was exactly what I needed to hear, because when I realized on my way to the hospital that the only relief I was getting through those contractions was by pushing, I was completely scared. I was scared that I was going to not make it to the hospital. I was scared I was going to birth the baby unmedicated. I was scared I was going to birth the baby in the car. I was so scared. But hearing the nurse say that it was okay to push in that moment, it reminded me that I was exactly where I wanted to be when I gave birth. And so I started pushing. We get to the delivery room and first thing I ask my nurses again is, can I get an epidural? She tells me that if I want an epidural, I can get one, but she thinks that I'll suffer more waiting for the epidural to get here and for it to kick in. Then she asks me what's my pain level on a scale of 1 to 10, and I say 7. She tells me that I'm doing amazing and I've already gone through the hardest part. My body is ready to start pushing. So if I want, we can start pushing now. In that moment, it was a little bit of fear and excitement. Fear that I would make myself suffer more if I wanted the epidural, waiting for it, and like she said, for it to kick in. Also, I felt like in that moment, the only relief I was getting was pushing. So I just couldn't imagine not pushing. So I tell her, I'm ready to push. We start doing some practice pushes and I'm moaning, groaning, all of the things. And my husband always says this, but he tells me that the doctor comes in and he says, it sounds like we're ready to deliver a baby. So he comes in, I do 3 sets of pushes with my doctor and my baby is born. My sweet baby was born at 7:07 a.m. at 6 pounds, 8 ounces and 19 inches long. And she is my whole world. After all of that, Chick-fil-A is the reason why I didn't get an epidural. Let me know if you had a similar birth experience or complete opposite, or if you went with a plan or preference and it didn't turn out the way that you thought it would. Despite the delivery and birth not going how I had hoped it would, I do think that it happened exactly the way it was supposed to, and I wouldn't have changed a thing about it.